A British Airways 747, carrying 263 passengers, is cruising through the darkness above Indonesia. It's a routine overnight flight, nothing out of the ordinary. But then the pilots notice something strange on the windscreen. An eerie glow, flickering and pulsing, smoke seeping into the cabin. And within 2 minutes, all 4 engines are dead. The cockpit falls silent. The aircraft is now descending toward the volcanic mountains of Java, with no power and no explanation. This is the story of British Airways Flight 9. On the evening of June 24th, 1982, British Airways Flight 9 was making its way from London Heathrow to Auckland, New Zealand, with scheduled stops along the way. The aircraft, a Boeing 74-7236B, nicknamed the City of Edinburgh, had already completed the first 2 legs of its journey and was now flying the 3rd sector from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia to Perth in Australia. This particular stretch would take the aircraft south across the Indonesian archipelago before heading out over the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean toward the Australian coast. The flight was under the command of Captain Eric Moody, a 41-year-old pilot with over 9,000 hours of flying experience. Moody was a former Royal Air Force pilot who had joined British Airways in 1966. He had flown various aircraft types throughout his career and was known among his colleagues for his calm demeanor and meticulous approach to flying. This reputation would soon be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. Joining him in the cockpit were Senior First Officer Roger Greaves, who would be handling the flying duties for this sector, and Senior Engineer Officer Barry Townley Freeman, responsible for monitoring the aircraft's complex systems. Together, the 3 men had decades of experience between them. The flight had departed Kuala Lumpur at around 8:40 in the evening local time. On board were 248 passengers and 15 crew members. Most of the passengers were settling in for the long overnight flight, adjusting their seats and preparing to sleep through the journey across the Indian Ocean and on to Australia. The cabin lights had been dimmed, blankets distributed, and the gentle hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, checking on passengers and clearing away the remains of the evening meal service. As the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, everything appeared perfectly normal. The weather was clear, the aircraft systems were functioning properly, and there was nothing in the flight briefing to suggest anything unusual ahead. The skies over Indonesia were reported to be calm, with no significant weather systems in the area. Captain Moody had left the flight deck to take a rest break in the first-class cabin, leaving First Officer Greaves in command. It was standard practice on long-haul flights for crew members to take turns resting. The first sign that something was wrong came shortly after 8:40 p.m. local time, as the aircraft flew south of the Indonesian island of Java. The flight engineer noticed something peculiar through the cockpit windows. A faint glow had begun to appear around the aircraft, dancing across the windscreen and around the engine nacelles. It was St. Elmo's fire, an electrical phenomenon caused by a buildup of static charge in the atmosphere. The bluish-white light seemed to crawl across the aircraft's surfaces like something alive. While St. Elmo's fire is not dangerous in itself, its appearance is unusual during clear weather conditions. Pilots typically encounter it during thunderstorms or when flying through heavily charged clouds. But the skies around the aircraft appeared clear. The crew watched with curiosity as the glow intensified, creating an almost ethereal display across the front of the aircraft. Some passengers seated near windows noticed the strange lights and pointed them out to each other, unsure whether to be fascinated or concerned. Then the situation began to deteriorate. Rapidly, a strange smell entered the cockpit and cabin, acrid and sulfurous like electrical burning or fireworks. Passengers noticed a haze forming inside the aircraft, a thin, smoky mist that seemed to seep in from nowhere. In the rear galley, flight attendants saw what appeared to be smoke coming through the ventilation system. They immediately alerted the flight deck. Captain Moody was called back to the cockpit. As he made his way forward through the dimly lit cabin, he could see the concerned faces of passengers, illuminated by the strange glow outside. The unusual haze hung in the air, giving everything an otherworldly quality. When he reached the flight deck and looked through the windscreen, what he saw stopped him cold. The St. Elmo's fire had intensified dramatically. The engines appeared to be glowing from within. Bright white lights visible inside their intakes, as if they were being illuminated by some internal fire. At 8:42 p.m., engine number 4 began to surge violently. The instruments showed wild fluctuations in temperature and pressure. Flames shot from the rear of the engine, bright orange against the darkness. Before the crew could even begin their emergency procedures, engine 4 flamed out completely. The aircraft yawed to the right. The crew began working through the engine failure checklist. Losing one engine on a 4-engine aircraft is manageable. The 747 is designed to fly safely on 3 engines, even 2 if necessary. But before they could complete their procedures, engine 2 began surging. Then it failed. The aircraft shuddered. Seconds later, engine 1 shut down. And then engine 3. All 4 engines were dead. The cockpit fell eerily quiet. The constant background roar of the engines vanished, replaced by an unsettling silence broken only by wild wind rushing past the fuselage. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panels. The main generators went offline, plunging portions of the cockpit into darkness before standby systems activated. The crew sat in stunned disbelief. A simultaneous failure of all 4 engines was considered virtually impossible. There was no procedure for it. No training scenario that covered it. The odds against it were astronomical. For a moment, no one spoke. Captain Moody quickly assessed their situation. Without engine power, the 747 was now a glider. A 200-ton glider. At 37,000 feet, they had approximately 23 minutes before reaching the ground. Below them lay the island of Java. Volcanic mountains, dense jungle. Darkness. The highest peaks reached over 12,000 feet. If they couldn't restart the engines, they would need to clear those mountains somehow. The clock was now ticking. The crew began making repeated attempts to restart the engines. They worked through every procedure they knew, trying different combinations of switches and settings, varying fuel flow and ignition timing. Each time they pressed the ignition, they hoped to hear an engine spooling up. Each time, nothing. Whatever had caused them to fail was still preventing them from running. Captain Moody picked up the public address handset. He needed to tell the passengers something. In what would become one of the most famous understatements in aviation history, he made the following announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our damnedest to get them going again. I trust you are not in too much distress. In the cabin, terror was setting in. The oxygen masks had deployed automatically as cabin altitude climbed. Passengers fumbled with the unfamiliar equipment, pulling masks over their faces, breathing cold oxygen. Some held hands with strangers. Others bowed their heads in prayer. Several wrote hurried notes to loved ones, stuffing them into pockets, hoping someone might find them. Children cried. Parents tried to comfort them while hiding their own fear. The cabin crew moved through the aisles, helping passengers, their calm professionalism masking the dread they felt inside. The aircraft continued descending at approximately 800 feet per minute. With each passing minute, they dropped nearly 2 miles closer to the unseen terrain below. The crew calculated they needed to maintain at least 11,500 feet to clear the mountains of Java. Below that altitude, they risked flying directly into volcanic peaks hidden in darkness. The altimeter continued its relentless countdown. At around 13,500 feet, with mere minutes remaining before reaching unsafe altitude, the flight engineer made one more attempt to restart engine 4. He adjusted the fuel controls, pressed the ignition. For a moment, nothing. Then the engine began to spool up. The instruments showed rising RPM. increasing exhaust gas temperature, stable fuel flow. Engine 4 was running. There was no time to celebrate. The crew immediately attempted to restart the remaining engines. Engine 3 roared back to life. Then 2, then 1. All 4 engines were running, though their performance was noticeably degraded. The pilots didn't care. They had power. Captain Moody began climbing, desperate to put distance between them and the mountains below. But as they climbed through 15,000 feet, a new problem emerged. The windscreen was almost completely opaque. It looked sandblasted, the glass frosted and scratched to the point where they could barely see through it. The landing lights simply reflected back off the damaged surface. The crew realized they needed to land immediately. The engines were running rough, their instruments showing abnormal readings. There was no guarantee how long they would keep working. Jakarta's Halim Perdanakusuma Airport was the nearest option. They declared an emergency and began their approach. But landing a 747 with virtually no forward visibility would be extraordinarily difficult. As they descended toward Jakarta, the pilots discovered that while most of the windscreen was opaque, a small strip at the very bottom of First Officer Greaves' side window remained relatively clear, perhaps 6 inches tall, just enough to see through if the pilot pressed his head forward and looked down at a steep angle. Using this narrow strip of visibility, combined with instruments and the airport's landing system, Captain Moody lined up with the runway. The crew called out altitude and airspeed, while Moody made constant adjustments peering through that tiny window of clear glass. At 9:10 p.m., nearly half an hour after the engines had first failed, British Airways Flight 9 touched down at Jakarta. All 263 people on board had survived. The investigation began immediately. When engineers examined the aircraft, they found severe damage to all 4 engines. Turbine blades were eroded and pitted. Combustion chambers were coated with a glass-like substance that had solidified in strange formations. Windscreen showed similar damage, its surface abraded as if attacked with industrial sandpaper. The culprit was volcanic ash. Mount Galunggung, located in western Java, approximately 110 miles southeast of Jakarta, had erupted several hours before Flight 9 passed overhead. The volcano sent a massive plume of ash and debris high into the atmosphere, reaching altitudes above 40,000 feet. But because the eruption occurred at night and ash clouds are invisible to weather radar, no warnings had been issued to aircraft. The crew flew directly into this invisible hazard with no way of knowing it was there. When the 747 flew through the cloud, microscopic particles of volcanic debris were ingested by the engines in enormous quantities. The ash, composed primarily of silicate, melted in the extreme heat of the combustion chambers, reaching temperatures where it became molten glass. This liquid glass flowed backward onto the cooler turbine blades, solidifying and accumulating until the engines could no longer sustain combustion. The windscreen was simultaneously sandblasted by abrasive particles, striking it at over 500 miles per hour. The engines restarted at lower altitude because the cooler, denser air helped break accumulated glass deposits from the turbine blades, allowing enough airflow for combustion to resume. The incident revealed a threat that aviation had never seriously considered. Within weeks of Flight 9's encounter, another aircraft flew through Galunggung's ash cloud and experienced similar engine failures. 9 volcanic ash advisory centers were subsequently established around the world, tasked with tracking eruptions and issuing alerts. New procedures were developed for detecting ash clouds. Pilots were trained to recognize the warning signs, including St. Elmo's fire, the sulfur smell, and the engine surge patterns that preceded the failures on Flight 9.